Welcome back to Sleepy Tech Stories, where we explore the quiet corners of technology's past, perfect for drifting into peaceful dreams. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on a very special journey. What if I told you that every icon on your screen was hand-drawn by a single artist, pixel by pixel? That the cloud computing you use every day was envisioned by a brilliant woman in the 1960s, 40 years before Amazon Web Services. That the microchips powering your phone trace their lineage to a Swiss physicist whose invention was so fundamental, yet his name remains whispered only in engineering circles. Tonight, we're traveling back to a quieter Silicon Valley, where the evening fog rolled over apricot orchards, and the future was being written in small laboratories by 8 remarkable individuals whose stories have been overshadowed by the giants they helped create. Picture, if you will, Palo Alto in the early 1960s. The air is crisp with possibility. Street lamps cast gentle pools of light on tree-lined avenues. In modest buildings scattered across this sleepy university town, brilliant minds are working late into the night, solving problems that will reshape our world. These are the forgotten legends of Silicon Valley, and their stories deserve to be told. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you on a pixel-perfect journey through the lives of 8 extraordinary pioneers whose quiet innovations echo in every device you touch, every screen you see, every connection you make in our digital world. In the beginning, there was darkness. Then, in 1884, a German physicist named Ferdinand Braun created something magical, a tube that could make light dance. The cathode ray tube, as it came to be known, was like a glass bottle filled with possibility. Inside this vacuum chamber, electrons would race from one end to the other, striking a phosphor-coated screen and creating tiny points of light. Imagine, if you will, sitting in a dimly lit laboratory in the late 1800s. The air smells of metal and electricity. Braun adjusts his apparatus, and suddenly a single dot of green light appears on the screen. It's barely visible, just a whisper of illumination, but it represents something profound. The first step toward painting with electrons. For decades, this technology remained in the realm of scientific instruments. Oscilloscopes used these dancing beams to visualize electrical signals, creating graceful curves and patterns that looked almost like abstract art. Scientists would watch these glowing traces, not knowing they were witnessing the birth of computer graphics. The real magic began in 1951 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Picture a massive computer called Whirlwind filling an entire room with its humming vacuum tubes and clicking relays. This mechanical giant had learned a new trick. It could control the beam of light in a cathode ray tube, making it draw simple shapes and lines. The first computer-generated image was nothing spectacular by today's standards, just a few straight lines forming basic geometric shapes. But to the engineers watching that screen, it was like witnessing the first sunrise. They had taught a machine to see, and more importantly, to show others what it saw. Let me tell you about a man named Ivan Sutherland, a young graduate student at MIT who would change everything. In 1963, Ivan was working on something he called Sketchpad. Picture him hunched over a computer terminal in the quiet hours of the night, using a light pen to draw directly on the screen. The pen looked like a thick pencil connected to the computer by a cable, and when Ivan touched it to the screen, magic happened. For the first time in history, a human could draw on a computer screen. and the computer would understand. Ivan could sketch a line, and the computer would make it perfectly straight. He could draw a circle, and the computer would make it perfectly round. More amazingly, he could create a shape once, and then copy it, resize it, rotate it. The computer remembered every detail. Sketchpad wasn't just a drawing program. It was the first glimpse of a future where humans and computers could collaborate creatively. Ivan had invented the concept of interactive graphics, though he probably didn't realize he was laying the foundation for every computer interface you use today. Around the same time, another pioneer was experimenting with a different kind of visual magic. John Whitney Sr., a composer and filmmaker, had acquired a surplus anti-aircraft gun director from World War II. This mechanical computer, originally designed to track enemy planes, became Whitney's paintbrush. Whitney converted this military hardware into what he called his cam machine. Picture this contraption, a complex arrangement of gears, cams, and motors that could control a camera with mathematical precision. Whitney would mount his camera on this mechanical arm, point it at artwork or geometric patterns, and let the machine create fluid, hypnotic movements. The results were mesmerizing. Spirals that seemed to breathe, patterns that flowed like liquid, geometric shapes that danced in perfect harmony with music. Whitney's 1961 film catalog showcased these effects, and suddenly the world glimpsed what computer-controlled imagery could become. The psychedelic movement of the 1960s would later embrace these visual techniques. But Whitney was creating them years before anyone had heard of flower power. These early pioneers were working with the most basic building blocks of digital imagery. Every image on a computer screen is made up of tiny dots of light called pixels, short for picture elements. In those early days, each pixel was precious. Computer memory was expensive and limited, so every dot had to count. The first computer games emerged from this constraint-driven creativity. In 1962, a group of MIT students created Spaceur on a PDP-1 computer. The game was elegantly simple. Two spaceships, represented by just a few pixels each, orbiting a star and firing at each other. The graphics were minimal, but the gameplay was addictive. More importantly, it proved that computers could create not just static images, but dynamic, interactive worlds. The beauty of these early graphics lay in their simplicity. Without the ability to create photorealistic images, programmers had to focus on the essence of what they were trying to represent. A spaceship became a triangle, a star became a dot, a missile became a line. These abstract representations forced viewers to use their imagination, creating a unique aesthetic that we now call retro, but was simply the cutting edge of its time. As the 1960s progressed, computer graphics began to find practical applications beyond games and art. Boeing engineer William Fetter coined the term computer graphics. In 1960, while working on cockpit design, engineers realized they could use computers to visualize complex three-dimensional objects, rotating them, examining them from different angles, and making modifications without building physical prototypes. The military, always an early adopter of new technology, began using computer graphics for training simulations. Pilots could practice flying in virtual environments, learning to navigate by instruments alone. These early flight simulators were crude by today's standards. Simple wireframe landscapes, rendered in glowing green lines, but they were effective training tools. By the end of the 1960s, the foundation of computer graphics had been laid. The basic concepts were in place. Pixels as the building blocks of images, vector graphics for precise line drawing, raster graphics for filling areas with color, and interactive interfaces that let humans communicate with computers through visual means. But this was just the beginning. The real revolution was about to begin as computers became smaller, faster, and more accessible. The stage was set for the pixel revolution that would transform not just how we used computers, but how we saw the world itself. The 1970s and 1980s brought a transformation that would make computer graphics accessible to millions. This was the era of the personal computer, when machines that once filled entire rooms began appearing on desktops and in living rooms. With this democratization came a new aesthetic, the distinctive look of 8-bit and 16-bit graphics that would define a generation. Let me paint you a picture of a typical evening in 1985. A child sits cross-legged on the carpet in front of a television, controller in hand, eyes wide with wonder. On the screen, a small figure in red overalls and a blue shirt jumps across a landscape of green pipes and brown bricks. This is Mario, and though he's made of just a few dozen pixels, he's about to become one of the most recognizable characters in the world. The magic of 8-bit graphics lay not in their realism, but in their ability to suggest entire worlds with the most minimal of means. Every pixel was carefully chosen, every color deliberately selected from a limited palette. The Nintendo Entertainment System, for example, could display only 25 colors on screen at once, chosen from a total palette of just 54 colors. Within these constraints, artists created visual languages that spoke directly to the imagination. Consider the genius of Mario's design. His red shirt and blue overalls weren't chosen for fashion. They were chosen because red and blue were distinct colors that would stand out against the backgrounds. His mustache wasn't a style choice. It was a way to suggest a face without needing to draw a mouth, saving precious pixels. His cap wasn't just an accessory. It eliminated the need to animate hair. Every element of his design was a solution to a technical limitation, yet the result was a character full of personality and charm. The artists of this era were digital poets, working within strict formal constraints to create something beautiful, like haiku masters who must express profound thoughts in just 17 syllables. Pixel artists had to convey entire worlds using only a handful of colors and a few thousand dots of light. The process of creating pixel art was meditative, almost Zen-like. Artists would work pixel by pixel, zooming in until each dot filled their screen, carefully considering the placement of every point of light. They would spend hours perfecting the curve of a character's face, achieved not through smooth lines, but through the careful stair-stepping of pixels. A technique called anti-aliasing that created the illusion of smoothness from discrete dots. Color was perhaps the most crucial element in this digital art form. With such limited palettes, every hue had to work overtime. Artists developed techniques like dithering, alternating pixels of different colors to create the illusion of new colors that didn't actually exist in the palette. From a distance, red and yellow pixels placed in a checkerboard pattern would appear orange to the human eye. It was pointillism for the digital age, echoing the techniques of painters like Sarah, who had worked with dots of pure color a century earlier. The golden age of arcade games showcased pixel art at its most refined. Games like Street Fighter II pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 16-bit graphics. Each character was a masterpiece of pixel art, Ryu's white GI suggested through careful shading, Chun-Li's blue dress flowing with implied movement, Blanka's green skin textured to suggest his wild nature. The backgrounds were equally impressive, depicting everything from ancient temples to bustling city streets, all rendered in the distinctive pixel art style. Animation in this era was an art form unto itself. Without the smooth motion we take for granted today, animators had to suggest movement through a series of carefully crafted still images. A character's walk cycle might consist of just 4 or 5 frames, but skilled animators could imbue these simple sequences with personality and life. Mario's bouncy gait, Sonic's confident stride, Mega Man's determined march, each was achieved through the careful sequencing of pixel-perfect frames. The limitations of the technology led to creative solutions that became defining characteristics of the medium. Since memory was precious, backgrounds were often created using tiles, small, repeating patterns that could be arranged to create larger scenes. A single cloud sprite might be repeated across the sky. A single brick texture might build an entire castle wall. This modular approach to world building created a distinctive aesthetic that we now associate with classic video games. Sound and graphics worked together in these early systems, each constrained by the same technological limitations. The beeps and bloops of 8-bit music weren't just nostalgic artifacts. They were the result of sound chips that could produce only a few tones simultaneously. Composers like Koji Kondo, who created the music for Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, worked within these constraints to create melodies that were both memorable and emotionally resonant. The home computer scene of the 1980s produced its own distinctive graphics culture. Machines like the Commodore 64, Apple II, and Atari 800 each had their own unique capabilities and limitations, leading to different aesthetic approaches. The Commodore 64's advanced sound chip and flexible graphics modes made it popular for demos, short programs that pushed the hardware to its limits, creating impossible-seeming visual effects through clever programming tricks. The demo scene was where pixel art evolved into something approaching high art. Programmers and artists collaborated to create short, audio-visual experiences that showcased not just technical skill, but genuine artistic vision. These demos featured scrolling landscapes, morphing shapes, and complex animations that seemed to defy the limitations of the hardware. They were digital galleries, showcasing what was possible when creativity met constraint. As the 1980s progressed into the 1990s, the technology began to evolve. 16-bit systems, like the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, offered more colors, higher resolutions, and more sophisticated graphics capabilities. Games like Secret of Mana and Chrono Trigger featured backgrounds that looked almost painted, with subtle gradients and detailed textures that pushed pixel art toward photorealism. But even as the technology advanced, the fundamental principles remained the same. Every pixel mattered. Every color choice was deliberate. Every animation frame was crafted with care. The pixel artists of this era were digital craftspeople, working within technological constraints to create worlds of imagination and wonder. The influence of this era extends far beyond video games. The aesthetic of pixel art has become a cultural touchstone, referenced in everything from fashion to fine art. Modern indie games deliberately embrace the limitations of 8-bit and 16-bit graphics, not out of nostalgia alone, but because these constraints force a focus on the essential elements of design, color, form, and movement. As we moved toward the end of the 16-bit era, the stage was set for another revolution. The technology was advancing rapidly, and soon, artists would have access to tools that would allow them to create not just flat, two-dimensional worlds, but fully three-dimensional spaces that players could explore from any angle. The pixel revolution had taught us the power of constraint and the beauty of simplicity. Now, it was time to add a third dimension to our digital dreams. The transition from 2 dimensions to 3 was not just a technological leap. It was a conceptual revolution that changed how we think about digital space itself. Imagine, if you will, the moment when flat, painted worlds suddenly gained depth, when characters could walk not just left and right, but forward and backward, when cameras could move freely through digital landscapes like invisible observers in virtual worlds. This transformation began quietly in university research labs during the 1970s, where mathematicians and computer scientists were grappling with fundamental questions about how to represent three-dimensional objects in computer memory and display them on two-dimensional screens. The challenge was profound. How do you teach a computer to understand depth, shadow, and perspective? Let me tell you about Ed Catmull, a young graduate student at the University of Utah, who would become one of the founding fathers of 3D computer graphics. In 1974, Catmull was working on his doctoral thesis, exploring how to render curved surfaces on a computer screen. His breakthrough came in the form of 2 revolutionary techniques that would become the foundation of all 3D graphics. The first was texture mapping, the ability to wrap a 2-dimensional image around a 3-dimensional object, like applying wallpaper to a curved wall. Imagine trying to gift wrap a sphere with flat paper, and you'll understand the mathematical complexity Catmull was solving. His algorithm could take a photograph of wood grain and wrap it seamlessly around a 3D model of a table, or take an image of brick and apply it to the walls of a virtual building. The second breakthrough was the Z-buffer, an elegant solution to one of 3D graphics' most fundamental problems, determining which objects should appear in front of others. Picture a complex scene with multiple objects at different distances from the camera. How does the computer know which pixels should be visible and which should be hidden behind other objects? Catmull's Z-buffer stored the depth information for every pixel, allowing the computer to automatically sort objects from front to back. These innovations were first demonstrated using a simple object that would become an icon of computer graphics, the Utah teapot, created by Martin Newell in 1975. This digital teapot was chosen because it contained a variety of challenging geometric features: a curved body, a handle with a hole, a spout with a complex curve, and a lid that could be separate or attached. The teapot became the hello world of 3D graphics, appearing in countless research papers and demonstrations. But creating 3D objects was only half the challenge. The other half was making them look real through the magic of lighting and shading. In the real world, we perceive three-dimensional form through the way light falls on surfaces, the bright highlights on a sphere's surface, the gradual transition to shadow, the way light bounces between objects to create subtle illumination. Henry Gouraud developed one of the first techniques for smooth shading in 1971. His method, known as Gouraud shading, calculated lighting at the corners of polygons and then smoothly interpolated the brightness across the surface. The result was objects that appeared smooth and rounded, even though they were constructed from flat triangular faces. Bi Tuong Fong refined this approach in 1975 with a technique that bears his name, Fong shading, where Gouraud shading interpolated brightness. Fong shading interpolated the surface normal vectors themselves, creating more accurate highlights and reflections. The difference was subtle but crucial. Fong shading could create the sharp, bright reflections you see on polished surfaces, while Gouraud shading produced more diffuse, matte appearances. These early 3D graphics were wireframe worlds, objects defined by their edges, rendered as glowing lines against dark backgrounds. There was something ethereal about these wireframe landscapes, like architectural blueprints come to life. The 1982 film Tron popularized this aesthetic, presenting a digital world where everything was outlined in neon light. The wireframe look wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was a necessity, as the computers of the time weren't powerful enough to fill in the surfaces between the lines. As computing power increased through the 1980s, solid shaded 3D graphics became possible. Objects could be filled with color, textured with images, and lit with virtual light sources. The results were still clearly computer-generated. Surfaces were often flat and shiny. Movements were mechanical, and textures were simple. But they represented a quantum leap in visual sophistication. The video game industry was quick to embrace 3D graphics, though the early attempts were often more ambitious than successful. Games like Battlezone presented simple wireframe tank battles, while Elite featured a vast universe of wireframe spaceships and space stations. These games proved that 3D graphics could enhance gameplay, providing a sense of spatial awareness and immersion that 2D graphics couldn't match. The real breakthrough came in the 1990s with the advent of dedicated 3D graphics hardware. Companies like Silicon Graphics created specialized computers designed specifically for 3D rendering, with custom chips that could perform the complex mathematical calculations required for real-time 3D graphics. These machines were expensive, often costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, but they made possible the creation of sophisticated 3D animations and interactive experiences. Hollywood was among the first to recognize the potential of 3D computer graphics. The 1973 film Westworld featured the first use of 2D computer graphics in a feature film. But it was Star Wars that really showcased the potential of computer-generated imagery. The Death Star plans sequence, created using a simple wireframe animation, gave audiences their first taste of what computer graphics could bring to cinema. The 1980s saw increasingly sophisticated use of CGI in films. Tron was groundbreaking in its extensive use of computer graphics, though much of what appeared to be CGI was actually traditional animation enhanced with computer techniques. The Last Starfighter featured some of the first photorealistic 3D spacecraft, while Young Sherlock Holmes included the first fully computer-generated character, a knight emerging from a stained glass window. But it was Pixar's work in the late 1980s and early 1990s that truly demonstrated the artistic potential of 3D computer graphics. Their short films, like Luxo Jr. and Tin Toy, showed that computer graphics could convey emotion and personality, not just technical prowess. The lamp in Luxo Jr. had no face, no voice, yet through movement and body language alone, it became a character the audience could connect with emotionally. The technical challenges of 3D graphics in this era were immense. Rendering a single frame of a complex 3D scene could take hours or even days on the most powerful computers available. Every surface had to be mathematically defined, every light ray calculated, every reflection and shadow computed. The process was so computationally intensive that most 3D animation was created offline, rendered frame by frame over long periods, then assembled into finished sequences. Real-time 3D graphics, the ability to generate and display 3D scenes fast enough for interactive use, remained largely out of reach for consumer hardware through most of the 1980s and early 1990s. The few systems that could manage real-time 3D, like arcade games such as hard-driven, used specialized hardware and simplified graphics to achieve playable frame rates. The mathematics underlying 3D graphics were elegant in their complexity. Every point in 3D space was defined by 3 coordinates, X, Y, and Z, transforming objects, moving, rotating, or scaling them. Involved matrix mathematics that could be applied to thousands of points simultaneously. Projecting 3D coordinates onto a 2D screen required perspective calculations that mimicked how the human eye perceives depth. Lighting calculations were particularly complex. For each pixel on the screen, the computer had to determine how much light from each light source would reach that point, taking into account the angle of the surface, the properties of the material, and any objects that might cast shadows. The most sophisticated lighting models attempted to simulate the way light bounces between surfaces, creating the subtle, indirect illumination that makes real-world scenes look natural. As the 1990s progressed, 3D graphics began to approach photorealism. Techniques like ray tracing, literally tracing the path of light rays through a scene, could create images that were nearly indistinguishable from photographs. The computational requirements were enormous, but the results were stunning. Reflective surfaces showed accurate reflections. Transparent objects bent light realistically, and shadows fell with natural softness. The democratization of 3D graphics came with the development of consumer 3D graphics cards. In the mid-1990s, companies like 3DFX, NVIDIA, and ATI created specialized chips that could perform 3D calculations in hardware, making real-time 3D graphics possible on home computers. Games like Quake showcased what was possible with hardware-accelerated 3D graphics, fully three-dimensional worlds that players could explore in real time. This was the moment when 3D graphics truly came of age. No longer confined to expensive workstations and research labs, 3D graphics became accessible to millions of users. The visual language of three-dimensional computer graphics, the way objects moved through space, the way light fell on surfaces, the way cameras could swoop and soar through virtual worlds, became part of our collective visual vocabulary. The third dimension had awakened, and with it came new possibilities for storytelling, entertainment, and artistic expression. But even as 3D graphics achieved new levels of sophistication, pioneers were already looking toward the next frontier. The quest for perfect photorealism and the dream of creating virtual worlds indistinguishable from reality itself. As we entered the new millennium, computer graphics stood at the threshold of a new era. The fundamental techniques had been established, the hardware was becoming more powerful, and artists were pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But the ultimate goal remained tantalizingly out of reach. The creation of images so realistic that they would be indistinguishable from photographs, so lifelike that viewers would forget they were looking at computer-generated imagery. This quest for photorealism would drive the next 2 decades of innovation, leading to breakthroughs that would transform not just entertainment and art, but our very understanding of reality itself. The journey toward photorealism began with ray tracing, a rendering technique that had been theoretically understood since the 1960s, but was too computationally expensive for practical use. Ray tracing works by simulating the actual behavior of light, tracing the path of individual light rays as they bounce around a scene, reflecting off surfaces, refracting through transparent materials, and eventually reaching the camera. Imagine standing in a room filled with mirrors, each reflection showing reflections of other reflections, creating an infinite regress of images within images. Ray tracing captures this complexity by following each ray of light through its entire journey, accounting for every bounce, every interaction with matter. The result is lighting that behaves exactly as it does in the real world. Perfect reflections, accurate shadows, realistic transparency. Turner Whitted's 1980 paper, an improved illumination model for shaded display, demonstrated the potential of recursive ray tracing, showing images with multiple levels of reflection and refraction that looked startlingly realistic. But rendering these images required enormous computational resources. A single frame might take hours or days to complete, even on the most powerful computers available. For decades, ray tracing remained primarily a research tool and an offline rendering technique for high-end film and television production. Movies like Jurassic Park and Toy Story used ray tracing and similar techniques to create photorealistic dinosaurs and the first fully computer-animated feature film, respectively. But these images were rendered frame by frame over weeks or months. Real-time ray tracing seemed impossible. The breakthrough came through a combination of algorithmic improvements and exponential increases in computing power. Graphics processing units evolved from simple 3D accelerators into massively parallel computing devices capable of performing thousands of calculations simultaneously. NVIDIA's introduction of RTX graphics cards in 2018 included dedicated ray tracing cores, specialized hardware designed specifically for the mathematical operations required by ray tracing. Suddenly, ray tracing moved from the realm of offline rendering into real-time applications. Games like Battlefield V and Control showcased real-time ray-traced reflections, shadows, and global illumination. Players could see accurate reflections in puddles, watch shadows move realistically as light sources changed, and experience lighting that responded dynamically to the environment. But even as ray tracing was being perfected, a new revolution was beginning: the application of artificial intelligence to computer graphics. Machine learning, particularly deep neural networks, offered a fundamentally different approach to creating and enhancing images. Traditional computer graphics worked by explicitly programming every aspect of how light behaves, how materials look, how objects move. AI-based approaches instead learned these behaviors from data, training on millions of images to understand the statistical patterns that make images look realistic. One of the first major applications was in upscaling and enhancement. AI systems could take low-resolution images and intelligently add detail, creating higher-resolution versions that looked natural rather than simply enlarged. NVIDIA's DLSS technology used this approach to improve gaming performance, rendering games at lower resolutions and then using AI to upscale them to higher resolutions in real time. The results were remarkable. AI upscaling could add detail that wasn't present in the original image, inferring what high-resolution textures should look like based on patterns learned from training data. A blurry texture of brick could be enhanced to show individual brick details, mortar lines, and surface weathering that the AI had learned were characteristic of brick surfaces. But AI's impact on graphics went far beyond enhancement. Generative AI systems began creating entirely new images from scratch. Generative adversarial networks could produce photorealistic faces of people who had never existed, create landscapes that looked like photographs but depicted places that had never been, generate artwork in the style of famous painters who had been dead for centuries. The implications were profound. If AI could generate photorealistic images of anything imaginable, what did that mean for photography, for art, for our understanding of truth and reality? The technology raised philosophical questions as much as technical ones. Stylogen, developed by NVIDIA researchers, demonstrated the power of AI-generated imagery by creating an endless stream of photorealistic human faces. Each face was unique, yet looked completely real. The system had learned the statistical patterns that define human facial structure, skin texture, hair, and expression, and could generate infinite variations within those patterns. The technology quickly expanded beyond faces to full-body images, animals, objects, and eventually entire scenes. AI systems could generate images from text descriptions. Type a sunset over a mountain lake with a small cabin and receive a photorealistic image matching that description. The boundary between imagination and visual reality was dissolving. Neural rendering took this concept even further. Instead of using traditional 3D graphics pipelines, neural rendering systems could learn to generate realistic images directly from high-level scene descriptions. NERF could take a collection of photographs of an object or scene and learn to render that scene from any viewpoint, creating smooth camera movements through spaces that existed only as learned patterns in a neural network. The entertainment industry was quick to adopt these new technologies. Films began using AI for everything from de-aging actors to creating digital doubles, from generating background crowds to enhancing visual effects. The 2019 film The Irishman used AI-based de-aging technology to make Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci appear decades younger, creating a seamless blend of performance and digital manipulation. Video games embraced AI-enhanced graphics as well. AI could generate infinite variations of textures, create realistic facial animations from audio input, and even generate entire game worlds procedurally. The promise was games with unlimited content, where every playthrough could feature unique environments and characters. But perhaps the most exciting frontier was the convergence of AI and real-time rendering. AI systems could learn to denoise ray-traced images in real time, allowing for photorealistic lighting with a fraction of the computational cost. They could predict how materials should look under different lighting conditions, generate realistic motion, blur, and depth of field effects, and even hallucinate detail in areas where the rendering resolution was insufficient. Virtual and augmented reality represented another frontier where advanced graphics were crucial. VR required not just photorealistic imagery, but imagery that could be rendered from two slightly different viewpoints simultaneously to create stereoscopic depth. The frame rate requirements were higher than traditional gaming. Any stuttering or lag could cause motion sickness in users. AR presented even greater challenges. requiring the seamless integration of computer-generated imagery with real-world video feeds. Virtual objects had to be lit consistently with the real environment, cast shadows that matched the lighting conditions, and respond to occlusion by real-world objects. The computational requirements were enormous, yet the processing had to happen in real time on mobile devices with limited power and cooling. The solutions came through a combination of specialized hardware and intelligent software. Modern smartphones included dedicated neural processing units for AI calculations, advanced image signal processors for camera input, and increasingly powerful GPUs for rendering. Software techniques, like simultaneous localization and mapping, allowed devices to understand their position in 3D space and track the movement of objects in the environment. The result was AR experiences that seemed magical, virtual furniture that could be placed in real rooms and looked like it belonged there, digital characters that could interact with real-world surfaces, information overlays that appeared to float in space at precisely the right locations. As we look toward the future, the boundaries between real and virtual continue to blur. Photorealistic real-time rendering is becoming commonplace. AI-generated content is becoming indistinguishable from human-created art, and virtual worlds are approaching the visual fidelity of reality itself. The metaverse, persistent virtual worlds where people can work, play, and socialize, represents the ultimate expression of computer graphics technology. These environments require not just photorealistic rendering, but real-time physics, simulation, realistic avatar animation, and seamless integration of multiple users in shared virtual spaces. The technical challenges are immense. Rendering photorealistic environments for hundreds or thousands of simultaneous users requires distributed computing systems of unprecedented scale. Creating realistic avatars that can express the full range of human emotion and body language requires advances in motion capture, facial animation, and behavioral AI. Yet the progress continues to accelerate. Each generation of graphics hardware is more powerful than the last. Each new AI model more capable. Each software technique more sophisticated. We are approaching a future where the distinction between computer-generated and real imagery may become meaningless, where virtual worlds may be indistinguishable from physical ones, where the only limit on visual experience is human imagination itself. The journey from those first flickering pixels on cathode ray tubes to today's photorealistic virtual worlds represents one of the most remarkable technological achievements in human history. We have learned to paint with light itself, to create worlds that exist only in silicon and software, yet feel as real as anything we can touch. And this is just the beginning. As artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated, as quantum computing promises exponential increases in processing power, as new display technologies offer ever more immersive experiences, the future of computer graphics stretches ahead like an infinite canvas, waiting for the next generation of digital artists to fill it with wonders we can barely imagine. Our journey now takes us into the precise, almost mystical world of analog electronics, where we meet Bob WIDLAR, a man whose genius lay in understanding the subtle dance of electrons through silicon. While the digital revolution captured headlines, Bob was quietly perfecting the analog circuits that make all digital devices possible: the amplifiers, voltage regulators, and precision references that turn the chaos of electricity into the ordered world of computing. Picture Bob WIDLAR in 1963, walking into Fairchild Semiconductor's Mountain View facility for the first time. He was 26 years old, fresh from the University of Colorado, with a mind that seemed to intuitively understand how electrons behaved in ways that others had to calculate. His colleagues would later say that Bob could look at a circuit and see the electrons flowing, as if he had some special vision that revealed the invisible world of analog electronics. In the early 1960s, most electronic circuits were built from discrete components, individual transistors, resistors, and capacitors wired together by hand. But Bob had a different vision. He believed that analog circuits could be integrated onto single chips, just like the digital circuits that were beginning to emerge. The challenge was that analog circuits were far more sensitive, requiring precise matching of components and careful attention to the subtle interactions between different parts of the circuit. Bob's first masterpiece was the A702, introduced in 1964. It was the industry's first true monolithic operational amplifier, versatile analog building block that could amplify signals, perform mathematical operations, and serve as the foundation for countless other circuits. But the A702 was just the beginning. Imagine Bob working late into the evening, his desk covered with circuit diagrams that looked like electronic poetry. He would sketch current sources and voltage references, differential pairs, and output stages, each element carefully chosen to work in harmony with the others. His circuits were elegant in their simplicity, powerful in their performance, and revolutionary in their integration. His next creation, the A709, became legendary among engineers. Introduced in 1965, it featured innovations that would become standard in analog design. The WIDLAR current source, push-pull, output stages, and compensation techniques that made the amplifier stable under all operating conditions. The A709 had a voltage gain of 60,000, an almost unimaginable level of amplification for an integrated circuit at the time. But Bob's greatest achievement might have been his work on voltage regulators. In 1970, he published a paper arguing that integrated voltage regulators were theoretically impossible. The power dissipation would be too high, the thermal effects too severe. Then, in a move that stunned the industry, he immediately proved himself wrong by introducing the LEM-109, a 3-terminal voltage regulator that could handle 20 watts of power while maintaining precise voltage control. The secret was Bob's invention of the bandgap reference, a circuit that provided a stable voltage reference, regardless of temperature changes. It was like creating an electronic North Star, a fixed point that other circuits could rely on, no matter what conditions they faced. This innovation became fundamental to virtually every electronic device, from the voltage regulators in your computer to the precision references in your smartphone. Bob was known for his unconventional personality as much as his technical brilliance. He kept sheep to mow the lawn at National Semiconductor, drove his Mercedes to work wearing sandals and shorts, and once installed a Hassler device that would emit an annoying squeal whenever someone spoke too loudly in the lab. He was an artist who happened to work in silicon instead of paint, a perfectionist who demanded that his circuits be not just functional, but beautiful. His design philosophy was elegantly simple. Designed for minimum phone calls, he believed that good circuits should work reliably without requiring customer support. That elegant design was inherently more reliable than complex solutions. His datasheets became legendary for their clarity and completeness, setting a standard that the industry still follows today. In 1970, at the age of 33, Bob cashed in his stock options and retired to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, where he lived a bohemian lifestyle while continuing to consult on the most challenging analog design problems. He later co-founded Linear Technology and returned to National Semiconductor, continuing to push the boundaries of what analog circuits could achieve. Bob WIDLAR passed away in 1991, but his influence on analog design continues to this day. Every smartphone, every computer, every electronic device contains circuits that trace their lineage back to his innovations. The $37 billion analog semiconductor market exists largely because Bob WIDLAR proved that analog circuits could be integrated, mass-produced, and made reliable enough to power the digital revolution. As we move from Bob's world of flowing electrons to our next legend, remember this: behind every digital device is an analog heart, circuits that interface between the messy real world and the precise digital realm. Bob WIDLAR was the master of that interface, the artist who taught electrons to dance in silicon, and his analog poetry continues to power our digital world. From the flowing electrons of analog circuits, our journey takes us into the revolutionary world of software, where we meet ADELE GOLDBERG, a woman whose vision of how humans and computers should interact was so advanced that it took decades for the industry to fully embrace her ideas. At Xerox PARC in the 1970s, ADELE was helping to invent not just a programming language, but an entirely new way of thinking about software and the relationship between people and machines. Picture ADELE in 1973, walking into the Palo Alto Research Center for the first time. PARC was Xerox's bet on the future, a place where brilliant minds were given the freedom to explore ideas that might not pay off for years or even decades. The building hummed with the quiet energy of innovation researchers working on laser printing, networking, and revolutionary new ways of interacting with computers. ADELE joined the Learning Research Group, where she began working with Alan Kay and Dan Ingalls on something called Smalltalk. But Smalltalk wasn't just another programming language, it was a complete reimagining of what software could be. Instead of the traditional approach, where programs were written as sequences of instructions, Smalltalk was built around the concept of object self-contained entities that could communicate with each other by sending messages. Imagine ADELE working late into the evening, her screen glowing with windows that could overlap, resize, and move around concepts that seem obvious today but were revolutionary in the 1970s. She was helping to create the first truly object-oriented programming environment, complete with a graphical user interface that used windows, icons, menus, and a pointing device. They were inventing the future of computing, one pixel at a time. The genius of Smalltalk wasn't just in its technical innovations, it was in its philosophy. ADELE and her colleagues believed that programming should be accessible, that software should be built from reusable components, and that the boundary between using a program and modifying it should be as thin as possible. In Smalltalk, everything was an object, and every object could be inspected, modified, and extended. ADELE's role extended far beyond programming. She was an evangelist for these new ideas, working to communicate the potential of object-oriented programming to a world that was still thinking in terms of procedural, code, and batch processing. In 1981, she co-authored a special issue of BYTE magazine dedicated to Smalltalk, introducing these revolutionary concepts to a broad audience of programmers for the first time. But perhaps ADELE's most significant moment came in 1981. When Steve Jobs visited PARC to see what Xerox's researchers had been working on, Adele was initially reluctant to demonstrate Smalltalk to Jobs. She understood the commercial potential of what they had created and was concerned about giving away Xerox's competitive advantage. But management insisted, and Adele found herself showing Jobs the overlapping windows, the mouse-driven interface, and the seamless integration of text and graphics that would later inspire the Macintosh. Jobs was mesmerized. He later said that the demonstration at PARC was like seeing the future. And many of the concepts that Adele and her colleagues had pioneered found their way into the Lisa and Macintosh computers. The graphical user interface that we take for granted today, windows, icons, menus, and pointing devices, traces its lineage directly back to the work that Adele was doing at PARC. But Adele's influence extended far beyond user interfaces. The object-oriented programming concepts that she helped develop in Smalltalk became the foundation for virtually every modern programming language. Java, C++, Python, Ruby, they all incorporate ideas that were first explored in Smalltalk. The concept of reusable software components, of programs that could be easily modified and extended, of development environments that blurred the line between creation and use. These were all part of Adele's vision. In 1988, Adele left PARC to co-found Park Place Systems, a company dedicated to commercializing Smalltalk development tools. She served as CEO, bringing her technical vision into the business world and helping to spread object programming throughout the software industry. Her contributions were recognized with the ACM Software Systems Award in 1987, shared with Alan Kay and Dan Ingalls, and she was inducted as an ACM Fellow in 1994. But perhaps more importantly, her ideas became so fundamental to modern computing that they're now taken for granted. ADELE Goldberg proved that the most powerful programming languages are not just tools for telling computers what to do, they're ways of thinking about problems, frameworks for organizing complexity, and bridges between human creativity and machine capability. Every time you drag a window, click an icon, or write object-oriented code, you're using concepts that Adele helped pioneer in those innovative days at PARC. As we transition from Adele's world of objects and interfaces to our next pioneer, consider this: the most revolutionary ideas often seem inevitable in retrospect, but they require visionaries to see them first. ADELE Goldberg saw a future where programming would be more like sculpting than engineering, where software would be built from living, breathing objects rather than static instructions, and where the boundary between using and creating would dissolve into pure possibility. Collaboration created the ecosystem that nurtured all the other legends in our story. Frederick TERMAN was not an inventor in the traditional sense, but rather an architect of innovation, a mentor whose influence shaped not just individual careers, but an entire region's destiny. Walking across Stanford's campus in the gentle California sunshine, the university was surrounded by apricot orchards and sleepy suburban neighborhoods, a far cry from the bustling technology hub it would become. But TERMAN had a vision. He saw a future where Stanford's engineering school would be intimately connected with industry, where students would move seamlessly from classroom to laboratory to startup company, giving them access to equipment, guidance, and most importantly, the freedom to explore their own ideas. With TERMAN guiding his students through the mysteries of vacuum tube circuits and electronic instrumentation. When Bill Hewlett developed his resistance-tuned audio oscillator in 1937, It was TERMAN who helped him refine the design, who critiqued the prototype and suggested improvements that transformed a laboratory curiosity into a reliable commercial product. TERMAN provided them with a list of potential customers, including Walt Disney Studios, which became their first major client, ordering 8 oscillators for the Fantasia soundtrack, gyroscope that provided both materials and partial salary for Packard. More importantly, he connected them with a network of contacts that every startup needs: suppliers, investors, and other entrepreneurs who could provide advice and support. He served on HP's board of directors for decades, startup to one of the world's largest technology companies, leasing university land to high-technology companies at nominal rates. This wasn't just a real estate venture. It was a deliberate strategy to create an ecosystem where academic research and commercial development could cross-pollinate. Eastman, Kodak, General Electric, and Lockheed moved into the research park, creating a concentration of technical talent and innovative companies that attracted more talent and more companies. It was a virtuous cycle that TERMAN had deliberately designed, and it became the model for technology parks around the world. That professors should work with industry, and that students should be prepared not just to join existing companies, but to create new ones. School from regional obscurity to international prominence. The university became a magnet for the brightest minds in engineering and science. And many of those minds stayed in the area after graduation, founding companies and continuing the cycle of innovation. And the expectation that technical innovation should lead to commercial success. He built bridges between the academic world and the commercial world, between theoretical research and practical application, between established companies and ambitious startups. And its expectation that technical breakthroughs should lead to new companies and new industries. All of these trace back to TERMAN's vision and leadership, not about building better devices, but about building better systems for creating devices. Frederick TERMAN understood that innovation is a team sport, and he spent his career building the team that would change the world. Our final legend brings us full circle, back to the world of semiconductors and the traitorous 8, but with a focus on a man whose special gift was making theoretical breakthroughs work in the real world. J. Last was the implementation master, the engineer who could take brilliant ideas and turn them into reliable, manufacturable products that would actually work when they left the laboratory. Picture J. Last in 1957, one of the 8 brilliant engineers walking out of William Shockley's laboratory in Mountain View, while his colleagues like Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore would become household names. Chase's contributions were more subtle but equally crucial. He was the one who could take Gene Hoerni's planar process and turn it into a production reality, who could take theoretical circuit designs and make them work reliably in silicon. At Fairchild Semiconductor, Jay headed the integrated circuit development effort, leading the R&D team that would transform the company from a transistor manufacturer into the world's first commercial producer of integrated circuits. This wasn't just about scaling up laboratory experiments. It required solving hundreds of practical problems that nobody had encountered before. Imagine Jay working with his team, Sam Falk, Izzy Haas, Lionel Katner, and James Nolan, Fairchild's clean rooms, developing the manufacturing processes that would make integrated circuits commercially viable. They were working with tolerances measured in microns, dealing with contamination issues that could destroy entire batches of circuits, and trying to achieve yields high enough to make the products economically feasible. The breakthrough came in 1961 with the introduction of Fairchild's micrologic family, the first commercially successful line of integrated circuits. These weren't just laboratory curiosities, they were reliable, manufacturable products that customers could actually use in their designs. Jay's team had solved the countless practical problems that stood between brilliant ideas and working products. But Jay's greatest moment came when MIT's instrumentation laboratory was looking for integrated circuits reliable enough to guide Apollo spacecraft to the moon. The Apollo guidance computer represented the first major production commitment to monolithic integrated circuits, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. A single circuit failure could doom an entire mission and the astronauts aboard. MIT selected Fairchild's micrologic type G3 input RTL NOR gate for the Apollo guidance computer. Each computer used about 4,100 of these integrated circuits, tiny electronic brains that would calculate trajectories, control rocket engines, and navigate through the vacuum of space. Over the life of the Apollo program, NASA used some 200,000 Fairchild integrated circuits, each one a testament to Jay's commitment to reliability and quality. Picture those circuits, no larger than a fingernail, sitting in the cramped cabin of an Apollo spacecraft as it hurtled toward the moon. Inside each chip were dozens of transistors, resistors, and interconnections, all working together with precision that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. J-Last's manufacturing processes had made it possible to mass-produce circuits reliable enough to stake human lives on. The success of the Apollo guidance computer did more than just help land humans on the moon. It proved to the world that integrated circuits were ready for the most demanding applications. If these chips could work in the radiation and temperature extremes of space, they could work anywhere. The commercial integrated circuit industry exploded in the wake of Apollo's success. Jay's approach to engineering was methodical and thorough. While others might focus on the most advanced features or the highest performance, Jay understood that reliability and manufacturability were just as important. He knew that the most brilliant circuit design was worthless if it couldn't be produced consistently and economically. This philosophy served him well throughout his career. After Fairchild, he continued to work on challenging engineering problems, always with the same focus on turning theoretical possibilities into practical realities. He understood that innovation wasn't complete until it reached the customer, until it solved real problems in the real world. J-Last's story reminds us that the technology revolution required not just brilliant inventors, but also brilliant implementers, engineers who could bridge the gap between laboratory and factory, between prototype and product, between possibility and reality. Every integrated circuit in your phone, your computer, your car carries forward the manufacturing principles and quality standards that Jay helped establish in those early days at Fairchild. The circuits that guided Apollo to the moon were just the beginning. Jay's work on manufacturing processes and quality control helped establish the foundation for the entire semiconductor industry, enabling the production of billions of integrated circuits that power our modern world. As we prepare to close our journey through these forgotten legends, J-Last's story serves as a perfect reminder that innovation is a team effort, requiring not just visionaries who can imagine the future, but also implementers who can make that future real, reliable, and accessible to everyone. And so, our journey through the evolution of computer graphics comes to a peaceful close. From the first tentative dots of light on cathode ray tubes to the photorealistic worlds that surround us today, we have witnessed one of humanity's most remarkable creative achievements: the ability to dream in pixels and paint with mathematics. Each pixel on your screen carries within it the legacy of countless innovations, the dreams of visionary artists and engineers who saw beyond the limitations of their time. The simple act of watching a movie, playing a game, or even looking at a photograph on your phone connects you to this grand tradition of digital artistry. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream in pixels, seeing the world through the eyes of those early pioneers who taught machines to see, who turned mathematics into magic, who transformed the cold logic of computers into warm human experiences. The story of computer graphics is far from over. Tomorrow will bring new techniques, new possibilities, new ways of seeing and creating. But tonight, rest easy knowing that you've witnessed the unfolding of one of technology's most beautiful chapters, the story of how we learned to make light, dance to the rhythm of human imagination. Sweet dreams, and may your pixels always be perfectly aligned.